My daughter-in-law smashed my $5,200 hearing aid and smirked. Now you won't hear us laugh. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. By the next week she was holding a certified letter from my lawyer. I'd spent decades as a court stenographer. This time the record I kept was my own, and when she tried to talk her way out, the evidence made sure she never saw it coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen Morris sat at the head of her small craftsman kitchen table, the morning light spilling through lace curtains and pooling across the butcher block counters. The new digital hearing aid nestled behind her right ear hummed softly, catching every layer of sound: the soft tick of the wall clock, the far-off lawnmower down the block, the faint rattle of jasmine leaves in the breeze. She cupped her mug of tea, steep strong, breathing in its citrus edge. The rhythm broke with the sharp clack of sandals on tile. Tara Morris swept into the kitchen without a glance, grocery tote in one hand, phone in the other. Her perfume arrived first, a chemical sweetness that tangled with the warm scent of tea. Borrowing counter space, Tara announced, dropping the tote beside the sink. She opened a cabinet, shuffled jars. "Don't mind me." Helen's eyes flicked to the bag. Tara pulled from the tote a fresh pouch of the dark roast beans Helen had bought yesterday from her favorite downtown shop. Plum label, artisan roast, expensive enough to make her savor even the smell. "Those are mine," Helen said, tapping the paper bag with a steady finger. "They're for guests." "I'm a guest?" Tara laughed lightly, already tearing the seal. "I live here." The grinder came out with a scrape, its steel handle glinting in the light. She poured in the beans and began turning the crank, the burrs groaning. Helen held her mug tighter. "That coffee cost money," Helen said. "It's coffee, Helen." Tara didn't look up. "You and your little receipts." Helen's gaze shifted to the hearing aid's reflection in the microwave glass. A small, precise device. A lifeline. 40 years as a court stenographer had taught her the value of catching every word. "You know," Tara said suddenly, "that thing makes you look like a spy. Bet you hear things you shouldn't." "It helps me hear what's said," Helen replied evenly, "and remember it." The grinder fell silent. Tara mashed the grounds into the filter with her knuckle. She brushed Helen's shoulder in passing, a touch just firm enough to claim the space. "This is my kitchen," Helen said. "Our kitchen," Tara corrected, filling the kettle. Helen set her mug down. "Luke likes this coffee. I'd like some left for him." The kettle began to hiss. Tara's mouth curved into a half smile. "Luke says a lot of things." She stepped closer, leaning over Helen's chair in a sudden mock-gentle gesture. Her hand rose toward Helen's ear. Before Helen could pull back, two fingers hooked behind the delicate arc of the hearing aid. "Don't," Helen began. Tara's eyes narrowed, and with a flick of her wrist the device came free. It tumbled once, twice, before striking the tile. The crack was small but final, a brittle fracture that silenced the kitchen's hum. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The pieces lay scattered, the casing split, the tubing snapped, the battery door flung aside like a discarded coin. "Now you won't hear us laugh," Tara said, her voice lilting, almost amused. Helen lowered her mug to the table with care, the ceramic touching wood without a sound. Her head felt strangely hollow, the edges of the room muffled and distant. Luke appeared in the doorway, damp hair curling at his temple, tie draped loosely around his neck. His eyes tracked from Tara's satisfied expression to the fragments on the floor. He froze. "What happened?" he asked. "Tara dropped something," Helen said. Her voice was calm, her movements precise as she bent to collect the pieces, the tile cool under her palm. "Oops," Tara said. "It was an accident." Luke turned to the sink, rinsing a clean cup, his jaw tight. "Let's not make this a thing." Helen wrapped the shattered aid in a folded cloth napkin, aligning the corners with deliberate care. "We will figure it out," she said. Tara sipped her coffee, the stolen beans releasing a rich, bitter scent. She met Helen's eyes over the rim of the mug. "Worth it." Helen didn't look away. The napkin felt heavy in her hand, the weight of what it contained more than just plastic and wires. Her phone buzzed once on the table. Then again, she glanced down at the message glowing on the screen. Marjorie's name, followed by a short question that tightened her focus. "You still know Philip Grant, right?" The next morning, the broken hearing aid rode inside Helen's handbag, wrapped in the same folded cloth napkin she'd used the moment it hit the floor. She kept it close, the weight of it a reminder, and drove through Savannah's narrow streets under a low, gauzy sky. The live oaks bent overhead, heavy with moss, filtering the light into a green hush. The audiology clinic sat in a row of refurbished brick storefronts, the glass front gleaming against the pale morning. Inside, the air was cool and clean, with the faint medicinal tang of disinfectant and the comforting undernote of fresh paper. Becca Hall emerged from the back, blonde hair pulled neatly into a knot, reading glasses hanging from a chain. She'd been Helen's audiologist for 2 years, meticulous patient, the kind of woman who never lost a screw or a battery door. "You look like someone broke your favorite china," Becca said, voice soft but alert. "They did," Helen replied, placing the napkin on the counter and unfolding it with care. The shattered device lay exposed, its delicate wires twisted, the casing split down the side. Becca lifted it gently, tilting it under the light. "Oh, Helen," her brow furrowed. "This wasn't a drop from a nightstand. This was force." Helen said nothing. She watched Becca's hands move, steady, practiced, almost reverent, as she inspected the damage with a jeweler's loupe. After a moment, Becca set it down and shook her head. "I'm afraid it's beyond repair." She reached for a file folder, sliding a form toward Helen. "A replacement will run about $5,200. It's a custom fit, with a full reprogram to your hearing profile." Helen absorbed the number without flinching. "Put that in writing, please. Detailed. Include the model, the cost, and your opinion that it can't be fixed." Becca glanced up, one brow lifting slightly. "Planning to file a claim?" Helen's mouth curved without humor. "Something like that." The printer hummed, warm paper sliding into the tray. Becca signed and stamped the document before handing it over. Helen folded it into her purse as if tucking away an ace card. When she stepped back outside, the Savannah air wrapped around her like a damp shawl. Marjorie was waiting on the bench near the curb, legs crossed, sunglasses hiding most of her face. She rose as Helen approached. "Well?" Marjorie asked. $5,200. Not repairable." Helen tapped her purse. "I've got it in writing." Marjorie's lips thinned. "Then you're calling Philip today." Helen hesitated. "I haven't decided." Marjorie cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Don't tell me you're letting that woman get away with this. You've got evidence. You've got a witness, me and probably Luke if he grows a spine, and you've got a lawyer who owes you at least 3 favors. Helen's phone buzzed in her hand. Luke's name lit the screen. She answered without moving from the curb. "I heard you went to the clinic," Luke said, his voice low, like he was speaking in a hallway. "I did," Helen replied. He sighed. "Look, can't we just let it go? For peace?" Helen's eyes followed a passing trolley, the clang of its bell sharp in the humid air. "Peace for who?" "For all of us," he said. "It's not worth turning this into a war." "It already is one," Helen said. She hung up before he could answer. Marjorie's hand was already on her arm. "Come on, we're walking to Philip's office." They made their way down a shaded cobblestone side street, the kind where sound seemed to stay close, echoing off brick walls. Philip Grant's law office sat at the corner, the brass plate on the door polished to a shine. Helen pushed it open, the smell of leather-bound books and old wood meeting her like a memory. Philip rose from behind his desk, tall and broad-shouldered, silver hair swept neatly back. He had the kind of voice that made people stop talking mid-sentence. "Helen," he said warmly, "what brings you in?" She set the broken hearing aid and Becca's report on his desk without a word. He read, his expression shifting from curiosity to something far sharper. When he finally looked up, there was a glint in his eye. "If she won't pay willingly," he said, "we'll make her." The sound carried faintly through the floorboards. Tara's high, staccato laugh, Luke's lower hum of words she couldn't quite catch. Helen sat in the front room at the small desk by the window, sunlight sliding across the polished wood. Her purse sat open beside her, Becca's damage report and the broken hearing aid laid out like evidence in a case file. Philip's voice came through the phone speaker, steady and clipped. "We're keeping it simple. Replacement cost, full reimbursement, plus the clinic's evaluation fee." Papers rustled on his end. "If she doesn't pay in 10 business days, we escalate." Helen adjusted her glasses. "That's fine." Within minutes, the demand letter appeared in her inbox. A precise column of words, no wasted space. The kind of document that read like a promise. She printed it on her best paper, the one that still smelled faintly of the cedar drawer it had been stored in for years. Philip arrived in person, his shoes clicking against the hardwood as he entered. "You'll sign here." At the bottom. Helen picked up her pen. Her hand was steady, each loop of her name carved into the fibers of the page. She thought of all the times she had typed out the words of others in courtrooms, every oath, every lie, and how now, finally, her own words carried weight. Philip slipped the signed letter into a certified mail envelope, sealing it with a firm press. The label was already printed, Tara's name and address staring up at them in bold type. At the door, Philip said, "She'll have to sign for it. That's the beauty of it. She can't pretend she didn't know." Helen followed him to the curb, the warm Savannah air clinging to her skin. The post office was only 2 blocks away, and she walked there alone after he left, the envelope tucked under her arm like a sealed verdict. The clerk stamped the form, slid the green return receipt toward her, and said, "All set. She'll sign for it or it comes back to you." That night, Helen was in the kitchen making chamomile tea when she saw movement through the front window. Tara stood on the porch in a tank top and leggings, hair pulled back, one hand on the doorframe as the mail carrier handed her the envelope. She signed with a quick flick of the wrist, her smile fading as she turned the packet over. Her brow knit. She tore the seal halfway, peered inside, then glanced toward the window. Helen stayed perfectly still in the shadows, the steam from her mug curling up like smoke. Upstairs later, she heard drawers opening, the muffled slam of a door. Luke's footsteps descended the stairs. He paused at the kitchen threshold, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's furious," he said finally. Helen stirred her tea, the spoon chiming softly against the porcelain. "So am I." The next 2 days passed in a brittle silence. Tara moved around the house with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, Luke avoiding both women like a man navigating a minefield. Helen tended her garden, clipped herbs and waited. On the 3rd afternoon, as she was arranging fresh rosemary in a vase, the phone rang. Philip's number flashed across the screen. She picked up on the first ring. "I got her response," Philip said, his tone edged with dry disbelief. "It came back fast." Helen set the vase down slowly. "And denial," Philip said. "And a few choice insults. Claims she didn't break it. Accuses you of trying to squeeze her for money. Papers shuffled. She even implied you're forgetful." Helen's lips pressed together, the faintest trace of a smile forming, not of amusement, but recognition. She knew the tone, the tactic. She had heard hundreds of witnesses try the same dance in courtrooms. Philip's voice sharpened. "If she wants to play this game, we'll play it better." Rain pattered against the craftsman's wide porch roof, turning the garden's brick path slick and dark. Inside, Helen sat with Marjorie in the living room, the faint scent of rain-damp jasmine drifting through the open windows. A small laptop balanced on the coffee table, its black screen reflecting the lamplight. Marjorie leaned forward, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. "You're sure you have it?" Helen tapped the touchpad, the screen blooming to life. Front and back entry cameras. And she clicked through the menu. The kitchen feed. On screen. The footage rolled. Helen at the kitchen table, tea in hand. Tara entering, moving around the counters. The conversation was muted at first, just their gestures giving it shape. Helen's still posture, Tara's restless movements. Marjorie's eyes narrowed. Turn the sound up. The speakers crackled, filling the room with the sharp grind of the coffee mill, the hiss of the kettle, and then Tara's voice, light cutting, drifting over it all. The moment played out exactly as Helen remembered, Tara leaning in, the sudden grab, the flick of her wrist, and the faint, unmistakable crack of the hearing aid hitting the tile. The sound that followed was the kind people claimed later they hadn't meant to be heard. Now you won't hear us laugh, Tara's voice said, crisp as glass breaking. Marjorie sat back, her brows climbing. Oh honey, that's not just proof, that's the coffin lid nailed shut. Helen didn't smile. She let the clip play to its end, where Luke appeared in the doorway, his pause, his deliberate turn to the sink. She clicked stop, then cued it again, this time watching Tara's expression in slow motion, the satisfaction in it, the sharp little glint in her eyes. Philip's voice came over speakerphone when she called him. Helen turned the laptop toward the phone, so the microphone caught every word of the recording. When it finished, there was a brief silence on the other end. Then Philip chuckled, low and certain. That's our case. I've also got the audiologist's report, Helen said. Good, Philip replied. One proves the act, the other proves the cost. Together that's unshakable, Marjorie muttered, and it'll make her squirm. Helen closed the laptop gently, as if tucking the proof away in a drawer. Philip filed the paperwork. Not quite yet, Philip said. Bring me a copy of that footage. I'll have it backed up 3 ways before we move. People get creative when they think evidence can be erased. By late afternoon, Helen was back at his office, the rain lifting, streets slick and shining under the thin sunlight. Philip loaded the footage onto his system, labeled and time-stamped. You understand, he said, sliding the USB drive into a small envelope. Once I file, it's public record. Neighbors could hear about it. Helen zipped her purse shut. Then they'll hear the truth. Back home that evening, Luke stood in the doorway to her sitting room, hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't quite meet her eyes. I heard you've got video, he said carefully. I do, Helen said, setting a book aside. Luke exhaled through his nose, gaze shifting toward the stairs. You really think this is necessary? Necessary? Helen tilted her head. It's the difference between my word and the truth caught on camera. His jaw tightened. She's not going to take this well. She already didn't, Helen said, her tone even. This isn't about taking it well. It's about making it right. Luke didn't answer. He left without closing the door. The next morning, Helen returned to Philip's office. His assistant handed her a copy of the filed claim, the black ink still fresh enough to carry a faint tang. The heading was stark. Small Claims Court. Plaintiff Helen Morris. Defendant Tara Morris. Helen read it once, her eyes steady. Philip stepped out of his office. The corners of his mouth set in that lawyer's smile that meant strategy more than pleasure. It's official, he said. We've filed. Helen folded the document neatly into her purse. Outside, the air smelled of wet brick and magnolia. Somewhere behind her, the courthouse clock began to chime the hour. The August sun lay heavy over Ardsley Park, pressing heat into the porch boards until they groaned. Helen sat in her upstairs sitting room, the ceiling fan slicing the air above her, the faint scent of lemon oil rising from the book in her lap. Below, the steady crunch of tires over gravel broke the quiet. A knock, firm, official, echoed through the craftsman's front door. Helen rose and moved to the banister, looking down the curved staircase. A sheriff's deputy in tan and green stood on the porch, one hand resting on a clipboard, the other holding a thick envelope. Tara appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her easy stride slowed when she saw the uniform. Mrs. Tara Morris, the deputy asked. That's me, she said, smiling with the kind of charm that came out at barbecues and PTA fundraisers. He held out the envelope. You've been served. For a heartbeat, Tara just stared. Then her fingers curled around the packet, the paper crackling under her grip. Helen saw the smile falter, replaced by a twitch at the corner of her mouth. Across the street, Mrs. Dunbar, who spent most afternoons tending her roses, stood frozen with pruning shears in hand. On the opposite porch, Mr. Larkin pretended to check his mail, his eyes lingering a little too long. "Have a good day, ma'am," the deputy said, tipping his hat before stepping back to his patrol car. Tara shut the door harder than necessary, the latch snapping into place like a warning. A few seconds of silence, then her footsteps, fast, heavy, pounded up the stairs. She pushed open Helen's door without knocking. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" Tara's voice was sharp enough to slice the air. In front of the neighbors, Helen calmly closed her book, sliding the ribbon marker into place. "I'm sure they'll recover. This is ridiculous." Tara continued, stepping closer. "You didn't have to make it so public." Helen looked at her evenly. "You made it public when you broke my hearing aid in the middle of the kitchen." "That was an accident," Tara snapped. "It was recorded," Helen said. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight, the kind that filled the space between them. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Luke appeared in the doorway, his expression tight. "Can we talk about this without shouting?" "She's dragging our family through the mud," Tara said, turning to him. "We can settle this, right? You'll talk to her." Luke glanced at Helen. "We can settle this," he repeated, softer now, almost a plea. "Yes," Helen said, rising from her chair. "By paying me what you owe." Tara made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. "You really want to humiliate us like this?" "No," Helen replied, her tone unflinching. "I want to be made whole. What happens after that is up to you." Luke rubbed his forehead, saying nothing. Tara threw the summons onto the side table as though it burned her hand, then stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. For a moment the only sound in the room was the slow creak of the ceiling fan. Helen reopened her book, finding her place as if nothing had happened. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. The name Philip Grant lit up the screen. "Thought you'd like to know," Philip said when she answered, his voice carrying the crisp satisfaction of a man who'd just sharpened a blade. "I'm amending the claim." Helen set her book aside. "Amending it how?" "Adding emotional distress and punitive damages," Philip said. Papers rustled faintly on his end. "Given the footage and her behavior since, it's justified. She's going to wish she'd written you a check the first time." Helen's fingers drummed lightly against the arm of her chair. "That should get her attention." Philip chuckled. "Oh, it will." The next evening, the dining room lights burned warm against the deep blue of twilight. From the garden, Helen could see their glow through the craftsman's wide windows, a perfect frame for the table where Luke and Tara sat. She had set her own place outside. Porcelain plate, cloth napkin, a small vase of rosemary and lavender cut from her garden. The air carried the faint perfume of jasmine climbing the back fence, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly watered soil. Inside, Tara's laugh rose and fell, sharp as a dinner bell meant to be heard. Helen took a slow bite of her lemon-roasted chicken, eyes on the roses edging the walkway, refusing the bait. By the third night of her absence from the table, Tara appeared in the garden with a wine glass in hand. "You know, Helen," she said, swirling the deep red liquid, "it's rude to eat out here when the family's inside. Makes people think you're sulking." Helen didn't look up. She cut another piece of chicken, the knife gliding without sound. "I mean," Tara continued, leaning against the porch rail, "it just seems passive-aggressive. Maybe that's what you're going for." Helen's fork paused mid-air, but she didn't speak. "You're not even going to answer." Tara tilted her head, smiling like she was in on a joke no one else understood. Helen took a sip of her tea, the steam curling past her cheek. When she finally glanced up, it was only to say, "Enjoy your evening," before turning her gaze back to the garden. That night, Luke knocked gently on her sitting room door. "She's making you look bad by ignoring you," he said, as if delivering a warning. Helen set her book aside. "I'm not ignoring her. I'm refusing to entertain her." Luke shifted his weight. "Well, it's having the opposite effect. She's telling people you're being hostile." Helen almost smiled. "Let her. It won't hold up in court." 2 days later, Marjorie arrived with a manila folder tucked under her arm and a determined glint in her eye. They settled at the kitchen table, Helen's space now reclaimed during the day, where the late morning sun caught the grain in the butcher block counter. "All right," Marjorie said, pulling out lined paper and a pen. We're drafting your statement. You're going to be concise, steady, and absolutely unflappable. Helen nodded, smoothing her skirt. I've done this before, different context, but same skill set. They worked through the timeline, each date and detail pinned down like a butterfly under glass. Marjorie read aloud what Helen dictated, cutting redundancies, sharpening phrases. Good, Marjorie said finally. You keep this tone in court, and she won't know where to look. Later that afternoon, Helen sat in Philip's office while he laid out the evidence on his desk. Glossy photos of the broken hearing aid, the printed invoice from Becca's clinic, the time-stamped video stills from the kitchen camera. The footage itself played on his laptop, the muted image of Tara's hand flicking the device to the floor looping every few seconds. This, Philip said, tapping the screen, is Exhibit A. This, he held up the invoice, is B. Together they tell the story without you saying a word. Helen folded her hands in her lap. And yet I'll still say it. Philip's mouth curved. Exactly. When she left his office, the August air was thick with the smell of sun-baked brick and distant salt from the river. She walked the short block back to her car with the unhurried stride of someone who knew the weight of her own pace. The next morning, Helen was pruning her lavender, when the sound of a car door closing drew her attention. A uniformed courier strode up the walk, a crisp envelope in hand. He knocked once firmly, and Tara answered, still in her robe. Mrs. Morris, the courier asked. Yes, he handed her the envelope. Notice of hearing date. You've been served. Helen watched from the garden as Tara took it, the pale paper stark against her red-painted nails. Her expression tightened, jaw working. The courier tipped his cap, turned and walked back to the curb. Helen snipped another sprig of lavender, its scent blooming in the humid air, and smiled faintly to herself. The morning light over Savannah was soft and pearled, the kind that blurred the edges of the craftsman's windows. Helen drove downtown, with the broken hearing aid still locked away in its napkin in her desk drawer. Today wasn't about the old one, it was about the replacement she'd decided to buy herself, at least for now. Becca Hall's clinic smelled faintly of coffee, and the crisp, clean scent of alcohol white. Helen settled into the leather chair while Becca unpacked a slim black case. These are the same model, Becca said, holding up the new devices, but I've adjusted them to match your exact hearing profile. Helen watched as Becca's careful fingers slipped each aid into place. A small chime sounded in her ear as they powered on. Instantly the world sharpened, the hum of the clinic's air vent, the faint click of Becca's pen, the sound of a car horn 3 blocks away. Perfect fit? Becca asked. Helen smiled. Better than perfect. By the time she returned home, she could hear the faint murmur of voices before she even stepped onto the porch. Inside, the sound drew her toward the kitchen, where Tara stood with a friend Helen, recognized from the neighborhood, a tall woman with a high ponytail and a laugh that came out in bursts. Oh, I'm not worried, Tara was saying, her voice low but edged with amusement. I'm going to make her look senile on the stand. Just wait. The friend laughed. A quick, sharp bark. You're terrible. That's the point, Tara replied. If she can't keep her stories straight, the judge will think she's imagining things. Helen stayed in the hallway, the cool wood of the doorframe under her fingertips. Every word was sharp, landing exactly as intended. She stepped quietly into her sitting room, opened the drawer of her desk, and retrieved a small digital recorder, one she'd kept from her court stenographer days. In Georgia, she knew, you could record a conversation if you were part of it or if it happened in your own home. She pressed record and set the device on the edge of the hallway console. Then she walked back into the kitchen. Morning, she said pleasantly. Both women jumped slightly, and Tara's smile flashed too quickly. Oh, Helen, we were just talking about garden club. Helen took a glass from the cabinet and filled it slowly at the sink, the water splashing softly. Is that so? Neither woman answered. Later that afternoon, she played the recording for Marjorie at the kitchen table. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the air with the scent of black tea. Oh, that's rich, Marjorie said, chuckling as Tara's voice spilled from the tiny speaker. She really doesn't think ahead, does she? Helen let the recording play through, then clicked it off. Philip will know what to do with it, and he did. That evening, in his office lined with law books and the faint smell of leather polish, Philip listened to the recording without interrupting. When it ended, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. Not only does this go to intent, he said, it also undercuts any sympathy she might get. It shows planning, malice. Helen nodded once. I thought you'd say that. Philip slipped the recorder into a labeled evidence bag. This goes into our prep file. Between the video, the audiologist's report, and this, we've got a trifecta. Helen left his office with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she'd just handed her opponent another heavy stone to carry. The house was dark when she returned, the street lamps outside casting long amber stripes across the living room floor. Luke was waiting in the doorway to her sitting room, one hand braced against the frame. She's bringing her own lawyer, he said, his voice low. Helen met his eyes without flinching. Good. The Chatham County Courthouse rose pale and solid against the morning sky, its steps wide enough to make anyone feel small. Helen climbed them slowly, her navy suit pressed to perfection, a single strand of pearls resting against her collarbone. The August air was already thick, but inside, the marble-floored lobby felt cool and faintly scented with polish. Philip met her at the security checkpoint, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. You're ready, he said, more statement than question. I've been ready, Helen replied. In the courtroom, Tara sat beside a woman in a gray skirt suit, her attorney tapping her fingers on the table in a restless rhythm. Her hair was too perfectly smoothed, her lipstick just a touch too bright, as if she'd dressed for a magazine spread rather than a hearing. Luke sat in the row behind her, eyes fixed on the floor. Helen took her seat at the plaintiff's table. The air hummed with quiet conversation from a scattering of other attendees, clerks shuffling papers, the muted squeak of shoes against tile. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a neat twist, entered, and the room fell silent. Philip began with the facts. He introduced Helen, described the destroyed hearing aid, and presented Becca's damage report. Then he set a small laptop on the table, angled toward the bench. This, he said, is the kitchen security footage from the morning in question. The judge leaned forward slightly as the video played, Helen at the table, Tara moving around the counters, the sudden reach, the flick of the wrist, the crack on the tile. The audio was clear enough to catch the words that followed. Now you won't hear us laugh. Tara's voice rang out in the quiet courtroom. Someone in the gallery made a small involuntary sound, half gasp, half laugh, before being hushed. The judge's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Philip continued, playing the second recording, the one captured in Helen's hallway. Tara's voice again, this time telling her friend she'd make Helen look senile on the stand. Your Honor, Philip said, this is not a misunderstanding. This is deliberate destruction of medically necessary equipment, followed by intent to discredit my client in court. The judge turned to Helen. Mrs. Morris, please explain your need for the device. Helen stood, smoothing her skirt. She spoke with the measured cadence of someone used to choosing words carefully. I worked as a court stenographer for 40 years. My hearing was my livelihood, and it's still my link to the world. Without the device, I lose clarity, especially in groups or noisy rooms. I cannot safely drive without it. I cannot follow conversations reliably. It isn't a luxury, it's my access to life. Her voice didn't waver. She let the silence after her words settle before taking her seat. Tara's attorney rose, heels clicking. Your Honor, the defense contends that the damage was accidental. My client was attempting to adjust Mrs. Morris's device when it fell. The plaintiff is exaggerating the incident for personal gain. The judge looked at the attorney for a long moment. And how do you explain the recording where your client says, now you won't hear us laugh? The attorney's lips pressed together. Poorly chosen words in a moment of frustration. And the second recording about making the plaintiff appear senile. The judge asked. The attorney hesitated, then said, hyperbole. From somewhere in the gallery, a low murmur rose, a current of disbelief running through the room. Helen kept her eyes forward, her hands folded neatly. Philip spoke again, briefly and precisely. Your Honor, the law is clear on personal property damage, especially when it involves medically prescribed equipment. We ask for full replacement cost and appropriate damages. The judge glanced at the notes before her, then looked up. I've heard enough. The room held its breath. In the matter of Morris v. Morris, she said, the court orders the defendant to pay the plaintiff the full replacement cost of the hearing aid, $5,200, plus an additional $2,000 in damages. A ripple moved through the courtroom, soft exhalations, a few murmured remarks. Helen allowed herself the smallest nod. Tara sat rigid, her attorney leaning in to speak to her in low tones. Luke didn't look up. Helen's gaze met Philip's and his almost smile said everything. 3 days after the ruling, Helen heard the sound of measured footsteps on the hardwood. She looked up from her desk to see Tara in the doorway, holding a slim envelope like it was toxic. This is yours, Tara said flatly, crossing the room. She placed the envelope on the corner of the desk without sitting, without meeting Helen's eyes. Helen slid it closer, the paper whispering under her fingers. She opened it to find a personal check, $5,200 for the hearing aid, $2,000 for damages. The handwriting was neat but pressed hard into the paper, each number carved in blue ink. Consider it over, Tara said, her voice like cold glass. Helen didn't answer. She placed the check in her wallet, the faint scent of Tara's perfume lingering in the air as she left. By mid-morning, Helen was standing at the counter of her local bank. The marble surface was cool beneath her palm as she slid the check across to the teller. The deposit slip came back stamped, the ink still damp. On the walk home, the air carried the tang of the river and the faint spice of a nearby cafe roasting beans. Helen felt the weight in her purse, not of the money itself, but of the proof that Tara had been made to pay. Philip called that afternoon. Congratulations on the win, he said. But Helen, have you considered a civil harassment order? Helen was silent for a moment, listening to the distant rattle of cicadas through the open window. I'm listening. Given the recordings, the pattern of behavior, mocking, intimidation, it's not a stretch. A harassment order would make it illegal for her to approach you except under specific circumstances. It sets a line she can't cross without consequences. Before Helen could respond, there was a knock at the back door. She found Marjorie there, carrying a grocery bag and her usual air of brisk certainty. I brought lemon bars, Marjorie said, stepping inside. And I heard from Philip you're thinking about the order. You should do it. Helen set the bag on the counter. He mentioned it. Marjorie unwrapped the bars, the scent of sugar and lemon filling the kitchen. Helen, you know this isn't the first time she's tried to push you out. Remember last Thanksgiving? The little digs about you forgetting where the serving dishes were? The way she tells Luke she's worried about you living alone. She's laying a narrative. Helen poured 2 glasses of iced tea, the ice clinking softly. You think she's planning something bigger? I think, Marjorie said, that people like Tara don't stop unless they're made to. They carried their tea to the garden, the sunlight settling warm on the tops of the jasmine vines. Helen sipped, considering. The sound of the street beyond the fence was muted, the occasional bicycle bell or distant laugh filtering through. In the evening, Luke came to her sitting room, hands in his pockets. Look, Mom, he began, his tone careful. I know she's been difficult, but maybe now that the case is over you could ease up. Be generous. Helen rested her hands in her lap. Generosity isn't the same as letting someone keep their hands around your throat, Luke. He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. It's just she feels humiliated, and if you push this order it's going to make things worse. Helen's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Sometimes worse is what it takes for things to get better. Luke exhaled heavily, gave a short shake of his head, and left without answering. When the house settled into its usual evening quiet, Helen sat at her desk, the desk lamp casting a warm pool of light over her hands. She opened her planner, found today's date, and wrote a single note. Order. The next morning she was back in Philip's office. He listened, nodded, and began typing. The sound of the keys was brisk, decisive. By the time she left, the paperwork had been filed. 2 hours later, Philip called her again, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "We have a court date for the harassment order, 2 weeks from today." Helen stood at her window, looking out over the garden where the jasmine swayed lightly in the breeze. "Good," she said. The courtroom was smaller this time, but the tension in it felt thicker. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the faint scent of copier toner hanging in the air. Helen sat at the plaintiff's table in a soft gray dress, her pearl earrings catching the light each time she turned her head. Philip shuffled his neatly stacked papers, his calm efficiency a quiet counterpoint to the stiff posture of Tara and her attorney across the aisle. The judge, a different one this time, with square glasses and a slow, even voice, called the case. Philip stood. "Your Honor, this is a request for a 1-year no harassment order against the defendant, based on a documented pattern of intimidation, verbal abuse, and targeted public embarrassment." Helen rose when prompted. She described the weeks since the hearing aid was destroyed, Tara's pointed remarks, the sudden slamming of doors when she entered rooms, the whispering just loud enough to catch. Her tone was measured, almost conversational, the way she'd learned to speak when taking testimony decades ago. "She's made it clear," Helen said, "that she resents my presence in my own home and will use any opportunity to undermine my credibility both privately and publicly." Philip clicked the remote in his hand, and the large screen to the judge's right lit up with screenshots, Tara's social media posts. The captions read, "Living with a paranoid grandma is exhausting. Ever wonder what it's like to share a kitchen with someone who thinks you're plotting against them?" One showed a blurry photo of Helen in the garden, taken from inside the house, her head bent over the jasmine vines. The hashtags were worse, petty cutting, meant to invite mockery. "This is the defendant's public online activity," Philip said. It was posted after the court's previous judgment. "It's not only harassment, it's designed to invite others to join in." The judge glanced at Tara. "Is this your account?" Tara's attorney shifted in her seat. "Yes, Your Honor, but no further explanation needed," the judge said. Helen stayed still, her hands folded neatly on the table. Inside, she felt the same quiet satisfaction she used to get when a jury foreperson read the verdict she already knew was coming. After a few more questions, the judge leaned back, tapping the end of her pen on the bench. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant is hereby ordered to cease all direct or indirect harassment for a period of 1 year. Contact is only permitted through the plaintiff's son, Luke Morris, in matters directly related to shared living arrangements." Tara's mouth tightened. Luke stared straight ahead. The judge's gavel came down with a soft, decisive knock. "So ordered." Outside, the afternoon was golden, the air holding the faintest hint of early autumn. Marjorie was waiting on the courthouse steps with a paper bag from the cafe down the block. "Peach tea," she announced, pulling out 2 sweating plastic cups. The taste of victory, Helen accepted hers, the sweet fruit scent rising up with the ice. "It's not victory," she said. "It's just a ceasefire with rules." Marjorie grinned. "Rules she can't wiggle out of. I'll drink to that." That evening, Helen was back in her garden. The jasmine along the fence swayed gently in the warm breeze, the blooms releasing their night fragrance, sweet, heady, impossible to ignore. She dug a small hole near the bench and lowered in a new plant, firming the soil around its base. From inside the house came the muffled sounds of a door closing, then footsteps retreating. Helen pressed the last of the dirt into place and sat on the bench, inhaling the mingled scents of soil and blossoms. The sun had dipped low when she heard the side gate creak. Marta, one of the neighborhood's more observant acquaintances, slipped in, her sandals crunching softly on the path. "I just came from the market," Marta said, setting down a paper sack. "And I heard something you might want to know." Helen turned her head. "Oh?" Marta lowered her voice. "Tara was in there telling someone it's all Luke's fault, that if he'd handled you better, none of this would have happened." The evening air seemed to hold still around them. Helen's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her trowel. The house had grown quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Luke no longer called her to the dinner table. Most nights he didn't eat there himself. His place at the table sat empty, the chair pushed in neatly, as if waiting for someone who'd already left. From upstairs came the muted thump of a door closing, and the low drone of the television in the bedroom. Tara retreating early, as if sulking were a sport she'd perfected. Helen, by contrast, spent her evenings in the garden. She lit the string of Edison bulbs overhead, and let their warm glow spill across the brick path. The scent of jasmine mingled with the earthy freshness of damp soil. She read, pruned, or simply sat, the quiet hum of cicadas steadying her heartbeat. One Thursday evening, the gate latch clicked and Mrs. Dunbar appeared, her straw sun hat still on despite the fading light. She carried a plate wrapped in foil. "I heard about the hearing," Mrs. Dunbar said, setting the plate on the garden bench beside Helen. "Good for you. Some people need to be told the rules." "Thank you," Helen said. "I'm learning that." The next day Mr. Larkin paused at the fence while walking his dog. "Saw you in court," he said with a grin. "Glad to see someone standing up for themselves. Folks forget you used to work in the system. You know how to handle it." Helen accepted the compliments without dwelling on them. They weren't about vanity. They were quiet acknowledgments that she wasn't invisible. No matter how much Tara wished it, it was Marjorie who planted the next seed. She appeared one afternoon carrying a flyer. "Senior Legal Rights Seminar," she announced, waving the bright sheet. 2 days from now, free coffee and pastries, and a panel of attorneys who actually know their stuff. "We're going." Helen hesitated. "I'm not sure." "You're coming," Marjorie said, already checking her phone. "If nothing else, you'll hear things that might keep you a step ahead of her." The seminar took place in a sunlit meeting room above a restored downtown storefront. Rows of folding chairs faced a panel table draped in navy cloth. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and sugar glaze from the trays in the back. Helen sat near the front with Marjorie, pen in hand, jotting notes about estate planning, home ownership disputes, and rights in multi-generational households. During a break, Helen moved toward the coffee urn. A woman in a navy blazer was pouring herself a cup, her press badge clipped neatly to her lapel. "Excuse me," the woman said, glancing at Helen. "You're Helen Morris, right?" Helen blinked. "I am. Do I know you?" "I'm Claire Harmon. I cover community and legal stories for the Savannah Chronicle." She offered a card. "I heard about your case from one of the attorneys on the panel. It's unusual and important. You stood up for yourself in a family conflict, and you won." Helen stirred cream into her coffee, the spoon clinking softly. It was about more than winning. It was about setting boundaries. "That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear," Claire said. "Elder law is rarely in the spotlight until someone's already been hurt. If you're willing to go on record, I think it could help others in your situation." Marjorie appeared at Helen's side, holding a napkin-wrapped muffin. "What's this, reporter?" Helen said. Claire smiled. "I'd like to interview her, get the facts from her point of view. Names, events, evidence. Of course you'd have full approval before anything runs." Marjorie's eyebrows lifted. "Sounds like free public relations to me." Helen sipped her coffee, watching the light spill through the tall windows onto the wood floor. She thought of Tara upstairs in her bedroom, Luke avoiding dinner, the neighbors quietly choosing sides. She thought of how many people in her position stayed silent. She set the cup down on the refreshment table. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll go on record." The Savannah Chronicle hit porches on a clear Thursday morning, the scent of newsprint mingling with the briny tang drifting up from the river. On page 3, under the soft blue header of the lifestyle section, the headline stretched across 2 columns, "Savannah Senior Stands Up to Family Bullying." Beneath it, a photo showed Helen seated in her garden, sunlight falling across the jasmine vine that climbed the fence. She wore her navy cardigan, and the faintest smile, the kind that belonged to someone who knew she'd kept her ground. The caption mentioned her years as a court stenographer, her case victory, and the harassment order that followed. By mid-morning, the story was everywhere. The Chronicle's Facebook page lit up with shares and comments. On local forums, people were tagging friends with lines like, "This is what standing up for yourself looks like," and "She's my hero." At Helen's own mailbox, the proof began to pile up. One envelope carried a neat return address from a stranger in Pooler. "My sister went through something similar." The note read, "I wish she'd had your courage." Another came from a couple in Tybee Island, thanking her for reminding people our voices still matter after 70. Some letters were written in shaky cursive, some typed in careful paragraphs, but they all carried the same message: you were heard. Marjorie arrived that afternoon, a copy of the paper tucked under her arm, and a grin wide enough to show every laugh line. "Look at this." She slapped the paper down on Helen's kitchen counter, pointing at the headline as if Helen hadn't already seen it 3 times. "Front page worthy heart in a lifestyle layout. You couldn't pay for this kind of press." Helen poured peach tea into 2 tall glasses, the ice clicking against the sides. "It wasn't about press." Marjorie sipped, eyes still sparkling. "Maybe not for you, but for every person reading it, you just gave them permission to fight back." Upstairs, a door slammed. Helen didn't flinch. Tara came down a few minutes later, barefoot, phone in hand. "You think you're clever?" she demanded. "My friends are texting me screenshots. Do you know how humiliating this is?" Helen placed her glass carefully on a coaster. "Not as humiliating as destroying someone's hearing aid in front of a camera." Luke appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, eyes on the floor. "Mom?" His voice carried more exhaustion than reproach. "You couldn't have kept it private." "It was already public the minute it went to court," Helen said. Tara laughed sharply. "No humor in it. You make yourself sound like some saint. People don't know the whole story." Helen stood, gathering the letters from the counter. "No, Tara. They know the truth." Tara's cheeks flushed. She turned, muttering something under her breath, and went back upstairs. Luke lingered a moment longer, then followed. Later, Helen called Philip to let him know about the article. She could hear him flipping pages on the other end of the line. "This is gold," Philip said finally. "A textbook case. The headline alone could open a seminar on elder rights. I'm saving a copy for my files and my next lecture." Helen smiled faintly. "I suppose that means you're pleased." "Pleased?" "Helen, you just gave every attorney in this city a perfect example of why evidence matters. And you've made it harder for her to pull any stunts in the future. People are watching now." That night, the garden lights cast a golden net over the brick path as Helen sat on the bench, a stack of letters beside her. The air was soft, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint salt from the coast. She read slowly, each word another thread, tying her more firmly to the community that had taken her side. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet. It was Claire Harmon, the reporter. "I wanted to say thank you again," Claire said. "The response has been overwhelming. We're planning a follow-up piece, more about the legal side, how you navigated it, what others should know. Would you be willing to participate?" Helen glanced at the pile of letters, then at the jasmine swaying gently in the night air. "Yes," she said. "Let's do it." The Chronicle's follow-up article had been out less than a week when Philip called, his tone deliberate, as if weighing each syllable. "You've won the battles," he said, "but you need to think about the long game. We should formalize your living arrangements." Helen sat at her desk, the late afternoon light catching in the glass paperweight beside her. Meaning you protect yourself on paper," Philip said. "Amend your will, add legal clauses to control what happens if harassment resumes. You own a share of that house, make it clear you can sell it if the environment becomes hostile." Helen turned the idea over slowly, like a stone in her palm. "I can do that." "You can do more than that," Philip said, "and it gives you leverage without raising your voice." 2 days later she was in his office, the scent of leather and paper mingling in the air. Marjorie sat beside her, legal pad in hand, ready to witness anything that needed witnessing. Philip read each clause aloud. Her share of the home was hers to sell at her discretion. Any proven harassment from Tara would trigger the option immediately. Luke would inherit her remaining assets, but only if he upheld the terms. Helen signed each page, her signature looping steadily, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the room. When she slid the final page toward Philip, the weight in her shoulders shifted, not gone but lighter, as though the ground beneath her had steadied. Outside, the warm breeze smelled faintly of salt and sun-heated brick. Marjorie looped her arm through Helen's. "You realize this is going to stun them, right?" "That's the point," Helen said. She didn't have to wait long to find out. That evening, Luke stopped in her sitting room, his face a mix of confusion and unease. "Philip called me," he said. "He told me about the clause." Helen closed the book in her lap. "I thought you should know. You'd really sell your share of the house." "If harassment resumes, yes," Helen said evenly. "I'm done pretending we're one happy household." Luke rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, that's drastic." "What's drastic," she said, "is thinking someone can break my property, mock me publicly, and still enjoy the comfort of my home without consequence." From the hall came a faint scoff. Tara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "So what, this is your next big headline? Elderly woman evicts family?" Helen met her gaze without blinking. "If it comes to that, yes." Tara's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. She muttered something low, just under breath level, but Helen's new hearing aids caught it perfectly. "You'll be gone before I will." Helen's reply was a simple, steady look that made Tara shift her weight and leave the room. 2 days later, the final paperwork arrived. Marjorie came over with a fountain pen and a thermos of sweet tea, her voice warm as she read each section aloud before adding her witness signature. The pen glided over the parchment-like paper, sealing the terms into place. "There," Marjorie said, capping the pen. "In black and white. No one can say they didn't know." Helen set the documents in her desk drawer, locking them with a small click. The sound was sharper than she expected, like the last stitch in a seam. That night she sat in the garden under the Edison bulbs, the jasmine scent richer in the cool air. The quiet no longer felt like retreat. It felt like possession. The house was hers, her place in it carved not just in habit, but in law. But as she listened to the breeze and the faint creak of the porch swing, another thought took root. She pictured a smaller place, sunlit and self-contained, with just enough garden for the jasmine to climb. No slammed doors overhead, no muffled whispers in the hall. The idea settled in her mind with the certainty of a signature on paper. The next morning, while Tara was upstairs and Luke had already left for work, Helen sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and typed into the search bar "Savannah carriage houses for sale." The carriage house sat at the end of a narrow cobblestone lane in the historic district, tucked behind a larger home whose brick facade caught the morning sun. 2 stories, pale yellow siding and a deep green door with a brass knocker that gleamed like it had been polished every day for a century. Helen stood in front of it with the keys warm in her palm, the faint scent of magnolia drifting from a nearby tree. She'd pulled the funds from an investment account she'd nurtured quietly for decades, court paychecks, small bonuses, interest that compounded in peace. The purchase was clean, cash, no mortgage for anyone to hang over her head. Inside, sunlight spilled through tall windows, pooling over the wide plank floors. She walked through slowly, her footsteps echoing in the open space. The living room was cozy but airy, with enough wall space for her bookshelves. Upstairs, the bedroom overlooked the lane, the kind of view where time seemed to slow. By the end of the week, furniture arrived, a mixture of pieces from her old sitting room and new finds from antique shops downtown. She'd chosen soft cream armchairs for a sunlit reading nook, and a round oak table for the kitchen, perfect for 2 or 3 guests. The back door opened to a small walled patio, where she planted jasmine in deep terracotta pots, their green tendrils already searching for something to climb. Marjorie arrived on moving day with 2 grocery bags and a box of wine glasses. "The essentials," she said, handing Helen a set of mismatched mugs they'd picked up together years ago at a flea market. They unpacked side by side, their rhythm easy from years of friendship, Helen stacking books in her shelves, Marjorie lining the kitchen drawers with fresh paper. The smell of cardboard, coffee and lavender cleaner mixed in the air, layered over the faint scent of paint from the freshly touched-up trim. Mid-afternoon, Helen's phone chimed. A message from Philip, all finalized. I'm sending you the full set of legal protections for the new property, digital and hard copies. No one can contest your ownership. She exhaled slowly, letting the certainty settle in her bones. This was hers. Completely. 2 weeks later, she hosted her first gathering. The round table in the kitchen was laden with lemon bars, cucumber sandwiches, and a tiered stand of scones. Outside on the patio, the jasmine was already budding, the warm air carrying their promise. Friends from the neighborhood came, along with a few from her years at the courthouse. They drank tea, laughed, and moved easily through the small rooms, their voices filling the space without tension or caution. "This is you," Marjorie said, settling into the reading nook with a cup of Earl Grey. "You should have done this years ago." Helen smiled. "I think I had to fight for the quiet to appreciate it." In the middle of the party, her phone buzzed again, this time Luke's name on the screen. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway to answer. "Mom?" His voice was soft, almost tentative. "Could I stop by later? Just me." She hesitated only long enough to glance toward the patio, where her guests were talking under the string lights. "Of course," she said. It was just after sunset when Luke arrived. The street lamps painted the cobblestones gold, and his footsteps were hesitant as he walked up the short path. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around at the warm glow of the lamps, the bookshelves, the little table with its vase of fresh jasmine. "This is nice," he said quietly. Helen poured him a cup of tea and handed it over. "It's peaceful," he sipped, eyes on the steam. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for not stepping in sooner, for letting things get as far as they did." Helen studied his face, tired but without the guarded edge she'd grown used to. "You were in a difficult position. I still should have done better," Luke said. She reached across the table, resting her hand briefly over his. "The point is, you're here now." He nodded, setting the cup down. The silence between them was comfortable for once, filled with the faint rustle of leaves in the courtyard. As he stood to leave, Helen walked him to the door. The brass knocker gleamed in the lamplight. "Luke," she said, as he stepped onto the cobblestones, "you're welcome here any time." She paused, her voice soft but steady. "Without Tara." Morning settled gently over the little courtyard, sunlight warming the brick walls and the terracotta pots where Jasmine reached for the trellis. Helen sat on the patio, tea cooling beside her, her chair angled toward the green. A breeze moved through the vines, the leaves whispering like paper in a turning book. She let the sound wash over her. Sparrows on the fence, a bicycle bell on the cobblestones, the faint hum of a radio from somewhere down the lane. Her new hearing aids rested so naturally behind her ears that she forgot them until a church band began to rehearse nearby. Light taps on a snare, a piano chord finding its voice. The notes reached her crisp and unblurred. A knock sounded on the green door. 2 brisk taps. "Open up," came Marjorie's voice. Helen rose and unlatched it. Marjorie stepped in with a bakery box and a bundle of daisies. "Still warm," she said. Already heading for the kitchen, they set the scones on a platter, steam curling from their sugar-dusted tops, and carried them outside. Butter and peach preserves sat in small glass bowls, glowing in the morning light. "We are celebrating the quiet," Marjorie said, spreading butter on a scone, which as it turns out, isn't quiet at all. Helen smiled. The breeze shifted, carrying the jasmine sweetness over the table. "I think I fought for the silence, just so I could enjoy the sound." They ate without rush. Marjorie narrated the neighborhood's small dramas, a stubborn dog, a flirtatious mailman, the river's scent after rain, and Helen listened, the familiar cadence of her friend's voice threading through the morning. "You're lighter," Marjorie said, studying her. "I am," Helen admitted. A hummingbird zipped to the vine and hovered, wings a faint tremor in the air. Helen reached to adjust the tiny rocker on her right aid. "Perfect," she said. "It's like someone cleaned the glass in the window of my head." Marjorie laughed. "Becca should use that in her ads." Helen's gaze shifted to the small cabinet against the wall, a key tied with ribbon in its lock. Inside, on the top shelf, was a velvet-lined box holding the smashed hearing aid from the kitchen floor. You still keeping that thing? Marjorie asked. Yes, Helen said. Some things you replace, others you keep. She crossed to the cabinet, turned the key, and lifted out the box. The broken device lay like a fossil, casing split, tubing severed, battery door snapped off. Marjorie studied it. Ugly little thing. Ugly reminder, Helen said. She closed the lid with care. Proof. The word lingered in the warm air between them. Proof had carried her through the courthouse doors and out again with orders in hand. Proof had been the difference between rumor and consequence. A knock came softer this time. Helen opened the door to find Luke on the cobblestones. No flowers, no box, just him in shirt sleeves, looking uncertain. Hey, he said. Can I come in? She stepped back to let him through. His eyes moved over the room, taking in the sunlight. The books, the neat little table set with tea. It's nice, he said. Peaceful, she replied, pouring him a cup. He took a sip, gaze on the steam. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for not stepping in sooner, for letting it get this far. Helen met his eyes. You were in a difficult position. I still should have done better, Luke said. She rested her hand briefly over his. You're here now, that counts. They spoke lightly after that. Work, movies, the new porch swing 2 streets over that groaned like a ship. It was the first conversation in months that didn't feel like walking a tightrope. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. The brass knocker gleamed in the light. Luke, she said, before he stepped out, you're welcome here anytime. She let the pause stretch, her voice soft but firm. Without terror. He held her gaze, then nodded, a small but clear acknowledgement. His footsteps faded down the lane, leaving the jasmine and the breeze to fill the space. Helen returned to the table, slid the velvet box back into the cabinet, and turned the key with a clean click. She sat again, adjusting the left aid just enough to remind herself of its presence. The day settled exactly where it belonged. Here. Hers. Some things you replace. Others you hold on to, just in case.